My name's Ariel Kennan, and I'm with the Digital Benefits Network. And we are so lucky to have Dan Honig not only sharing his new book, but as a colleague here at Georgetown participating at BenCon. Dan is an associate professor of public policy at the University College London's School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science, and an associate professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, the very building we are in. He's also a member of Georgetown's Better Government Lab, a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, and an associate of Harvard's Building State Capability Program, and on the editorial board of the Journal of Public Policy, amongst other appointments. He's the principal investigator on relational state capacity, a European Research Council awarded 5-year exploration of state capacity. He is going to share with us about his most recent book, Mission Driven Bureaucrats. It is out now, and if you're with us here in person, there's still some copies available out on the tables outside the auditorium, so I hope you will grab one on your way out. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dan.
Thanks so much. It is just such an honor to be here today to talk to you about this book, Mission Driven Bureaucrats. And you know, I think I'm literally preaching to the choir in the sense that I think I'm looking at a room full of the kinds of people who I seek to profile and highlight here. So I think we have a little bit of a trouble with the rendering, but this is meant to be a comparison of management for compliance and management for empowerment, right? So this is kind of the basic theoretic framework of the book. So, you know, on the one hand, kind of in the route that you see at the bottom depicted in red, we have the idea of bureaucrats who aren't going to do the things we want them to do, and so we are going to try to get them to do those things through incentives and penalties by aligning their action with whatever the mission of the organization is. On the other hand, if we have people in the public service who want to do the thing that is the thing their agency or team or organization is doing, well, then we need to manage perhaps in a different way. We need to support that motivation by allowing autonomy, cultivating competence, and creating connections to peers and purpose. You know, and my framework is not that like one of these is the right answer and one of them is the wrong one. It's that it really depends on what we're trying to accomplish, who we have in the agency, and you know, the kind of managerial tools available to us. So in the book, I use data from a wide range of sources, myself and some which I've done, projects I've done myself, some by other scholars. I also have profiles of particular mission-driven bureaucrats. I'm, of course, just going to touch on this evidence over the next few minutes, or the next 15 minutes or so. And I'm going to try to do it through the frame of what I think I learned through the process of writing this book, right? Where I think it left me. And I think my first lesson for myself was that management is not, it's not that there are good types of people and bad types of people. It's that, as Dolly Parton, the famous scholar Dolly Parton once said, right? Some of us are saints, and some of us are sinners, and for all the rest of us, it sure does depend, right? And one of the things it depends on is management practice, right? So this is a picture of Judy Parfitt, who's profiled in the book. Judy was the head of human resources for the South Africa Revenue Service immediately after the end of the apartheid era, right? So she inherited an agency full of people who were closely aligned with the National Front regime, which had recently lost power, right? And you might say, and it was a low-performing agency at that. And you might say, well, clearly we need to get rid of all these folks and get new people in who are aligned with the mission of the new South Africa. That wasn't the experience of Judy and her team. Their experience instead was that the people at the agency had skills and resources, and that almost all of them could come on board the new vision. What did it take? Did it take lots of money to increase their salaries, to get them excited about this new regime? No, not at all. It was about giving them the sense that their action was agentic, that through the things they did, they could have a positive impact on the mission of the agency and in this process of building the new South Africa. This is consistent with what I find in my own work. These are pictures of Thai district offices buildings. These buildings look identical, but inside them, of course, are people who manage in different ways. And I find that the more the people inside them manage in a way that empowers their personnel, the more motivated those personnel are, the more satisfied they are with their jobs, the more likely they are to deliver on citizens' welfare, particularly when there's a tension between that welfare and sort of the frameworks and rules and regulations coming down from Bangkok. This is generally true. So this pulls from big data, so 4 million observations, 2,000 agencies, 20 years, 5 countries approximately. And what this is showing you is that when inside an agency, a managerial practice which empowers goes up, so too does the motivation of the staff, right? If year on year, I get more autonomy, if year on year I feel greater psychological safety, then year on year the people in that agency are more motivated to accomplish the mission of that agency. Second lesson, management isn't just about today. It's also about the staff we have tomorrow. And that's because management attracts and repels people from the agency. Turning now to my hometown of Detroit, right? I look with colleagues, with collaborators at Wayne State University, which is the city university of Detroit. We find that the more Child Protective Services officers are motivated by helping kids on entry, the faster they leave. You heard me correctly. The more people care about helping the kids, the quicker they walk out the door. Why is that? Well, because they find that they enter an agency in which the burdens of paperwork and reporting, the incentives to pull kids out of their homes and put them in a largely inadequate foster care system are so strong that the people who are most attracted to the mission of the agency find they can't fulfill it, are most unfulfilled, and leave the fastest. So I know I couldn't do this job, right? So I know, having spoken to these social workers, this would be too much for me. But I am pretty sure that the people who I want making these judgment calls are the people who care most about the children of my hometown. And if that's not happening, I think we need to step back and ask how we get to managerial practices that lead it to happen. So what we find in Detroit is also true in the larger data. So what this is showing you is that the higher the level of mission motivation, the more responsive people are to management practice in terms of their intent to leave. So what does that mean? If I come to an agency and I really care about serving the mission of that agency, and management practice lets me do that, guess what? I am much more likely to stay than people who feel less that way. But the opposite is also true. As we see in Detroit, the more I care on my way in, if I'm unable to fulfill that mission, the faster I walk out the door. So, third lesson, empowerment-oriented reform. So when we've got an agency and we say, okay, should we move in a direction of more empowerment or a direction of more compliance in terms of improving performance? We see over and over again that empowerment wins. In fact, we see that empowerment wins vastly more often than my own theory predicts, right? That is to say, I think there are tasks for which compliance is likely to be a good solution. But even for those tasks, so taking the last bullet on this slide, for example, looking at procurement agencies in Pakistani Punjab, right? Which might be a setting where you say, well, we can monitor everything, right? Let's do it. Let's drive performance that way. It still is the case that people respond to more autonomy, right? To more support with better performance than they do a scheme that actually gives them more money in their paychecks for saving the government money. Why is this? Well, it is because over-reliance on compliance, is my view, is all too often the norm. So even if we're looking at a task where compliance is relatively better, we are using so much compliance that we have even more than that again. And so a move towards less compliance is leading to better performance. So what do I mean in terms of sort of a case, right? This is, of course, a picture of the destruction wrought by Hurricane Sandy nearly a decade ago. And in the book, I talk about the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? So HUD got a supplemental appropriation in response to Sandy to help with reconstruction. The exact same amount of money as went to HUD went to the Office of the Inspector General to make sure HUD was using the monies they received appropriately, right? Which means, as you're all thinking, in fact, a majority of funds, because HUD was doing its own oversight, went to checking the minority of funds that could actually go to citizens. And you might say, well, it feels like we maybe could spend those funds better, and I agree, but that's only the beginning of why that's a problem, right? Because what happens when you manage for compliance this way? Well, now the public servants working for HUD need to make sure everyone evidences and documents things in a way that they can then demonstrate to an OIG who's nowhere near the ground. And who do you think can evidence and document things right after a hurricane? It is the relatively well-off who can look at that safe deposit box and pull out those documents, who have that iPhone, right, that lets them, show that mortgage statement on the ground. And that's exactly what happened, right? So, the poorer the family, the less likely they'll be able to produce the documentation. Compliance is not just about money that could have been better spent on beneficiaries. It's also about the frictions and inequities that such a system yields. So since this is a digital benefits conference, one of the questions Ariel asked me was, how does kind of technology feature in this story, right? And my answer is that technology is really powerful. It can be a powerful force of empowerment, but it can also be a powerful force of compliance. For those of you who are here for the second consecutive year, you saw this slide last year in Jen Palka's presentation, in which she talked about how regulation around electronic medical records was expected to chase physicians out of primary care, right? That is a regulatory compliance mechanism that, in her telling, was anticipated to drive some of the best providers out of the system. Luckily, a brilliant digital transformation team helped make that far less the case than it could have been. But it points up the ability of a technology rollout to be a force of compliance that drives out those who care the most. Focusing on this kind of doctor-patient relationship. So, and putting aside, by the way, ChatGPT's implicit biases, which lead to the identity of the doctor and patient here, as DALL-E generates a picture here. Whether we think of government as the employer, whether we're in a public health scheme and we think of this doctor as a public servant, or whether we think of government as the regulator, right? We have in mind, I think often, an old-fashioned model in which that doctor could look directly at that patient, in which connections could be formed, in which accountability centered on the citizen. And all too often, technology, at least in kind of like a 1.0 rollout of digital tools, has recentered that doctor's attention away from the patient and towards a screen, towards an accountability framework which fundamentally is about compliance up a chain of delivery. But it need not be that way. And we've been talking throughout these 2 days about AI-empowered tools that offer the possibility of a different way of thinking about what that patient-doctor relationship looks like. Technology can be an incredible tool of empowerment. It can be a tool of empowerment that provides data and decision support for citizens, but also for bureaucrats, for those who work in the public sector, and empowers them to make better decisions with more information, to cultivate competence in new ways. I see real promise in the AI revolution and the possibility that those parts of every job, which have to be about compliance and reporting, can be separated from those parts of the job which are about the human judgment and agency, which only a skilled individual, a skilled human can exercise. So more empowerment is often achievable without reducing current compliance, right? So we can shift from a system which focuses on accountability up via rules to one which thinks about accountability in different ways. But we don't always have to. There are many, many ways to empower a team, as those of you who lead teams, which I think is almost all of you, know, right? So they can involve things as simple as encouraging self-directed development or establishing a clear mission point. And to the extent that I think those in this room spend a lot of time working with other teams, right, outside their own, this is something that can also be sort of conveyed and transmitted to others others in the organization. There are solutions that help you empower teams, not just the individuals on those teams. For leaders to restructure and empower agencies, and of course for leaders to reform recruitment. And for those of you who do pick up the book, whole chapter full of evidence-based possible solutions that I hope, at least some of which, speak to something that might add value to you and your team going forward. Let me close where the book opens, with this gentleman. So his name is Joseph Roberts, and this picture, you might think this is not a great quality photograph, and that is right. This is a picture taken by me on an evacuation flight leaving Senegal, where I was then living at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And Joseph here is an employee of the US Department of State Operations Medicine team, helping to run an evacuation flight. And something remarkable happened that day on that flight, at least for me, which is a bureaucrat doing his job and just talking about how much he was honored to do his job led to a plane full of my fellow citizens and I applauding his service, right? I was so grateful that Joseph was there that day. I think all of us were on that plane. And when I went back and I interviewed Joseph after many bureaucratic permissions that allowed me to do so a few months later, I found Joseph said this to me, what's quoted at the bottom here, right? If I didn't feel like I was accomplishing anything here and I didn't feel like I was trusted, I probably wouldn't be long for this job. No one would. What he means, of course, is no one mission motivated would. And that's right. That's what the evidence shows. That if you want people who are devoted to the job to stay in the job, they need to be managed in a way that gives them a sense of accomplishment, that gives them the ability to forward the mission that they care about. There are so many public servants, including those in this room, of course, who want to help citizens. The point of my book, in some ways, is that we should let them. And the more we do, the better we'll do, as individuals, as a public service, and as a society. Thank you.
Say, I had the pleasure of reading some of Dan's book because he sent me a preview PDF, so I've gotten to read that. And seeing Joseph's picture when I was previewing your slides was like, it's him, it's him. It's just a really beautiful story that opens the book. So I hope you all will take the time to read about the wonderful public servants all over the world who are doing this work, and I think really sharing some of the common problems that we have, but also the really common humanity that we have is really, really beautiful. Dan, you talked some about kind of work monitoring and the compliance side of work, but a lot of us here work on digital services, which are actually the face of the services, and that's what citizens see. They might not see the people behind those systems. And do you have some ideas about how bureaucrats can feel connected to the people they are serving when they are using digital services?
Yeah, thank you. So, this question of how so I've already heard in these 2 days, folks talk about the need to center the user experience and create those connections. And I think, even if the interface on an everyday basis is a digital one, we can think about connections between typical users and the team. I imagine that a digital benefits team sitting next to the intake office, right, where people are still showing up for the unemployment benefits, to the extent that that's happening, is going to have a different experience than one who's very far away. It's Darnell. I was moved by your. Is it Darnell? Do I have the name right? That's okay. So I was moved by your talking about the experience of actually going to the office and sitting there and trying to make that connection and being flexible and understanding what the work looks like. And so, it seems to me that digital benefits teams that have a deeper and more nuanced understanding of those clients and those client provider experiences are going to stay more connected to the beneficiaries of that work.
Yeah. I think also in popular culture having some common parlance teachers and social workers, the bureaucrats that we like and the things that we call the members of our family who we really admire, right? It's really hard when you're I'm a product director or manager, or there's some really long title research systems analyst. So you're what is that, and it's people who are doing incredible work to serve other humans. Moving a little bit to advice on adaptation, what advice do you have for students or maybe people who are a little earlier in their call to mission?
Yeah, I mean, the first is find something you're passionate about. Right? So, you need to care about something. And then find a place where you can make that passion happen, right? So, I have a paper from some years ago that talks about the kind of Tuesday morning at 10 phenomenon, right? So if you're not feeling like the job is meaningful Tuesday at 10, it doesn't matter how much you care about the kind of ultimate goal of the work you're doing, you're not going to be able to sustain that motivation. And so finding, leaders and mentors, finding the folks like those in this room who are passionate enough about what they do to want to come to a conference in Washington, D.C. and talk about it for however many days, I think that's really critical. And, the exciting thing is that the public service is full, as you say, of people who really care. And so finding a boss who feels that way, finding a mentor who feels that way, it's not simple, but it's also far from impossible. And, what I see in my own students is we have an increasing narrative of hopelessness, an increasing narrative that the world, we face many challenges, right? But to turn that into a lack of agency is, to me, the greatest tragedy, because our world has and will move forward in incredible ways. And the reason it will is because of the passion and agency and dedication of humans. That's what we see all around the world.
I know I encourage my students and also a lot of younger people that I mentor of please go do time in public service. You don't have to stay there forever, but please spend some of your career there. It is, you missed my opening yesterday where I talked about my call to mission, inspired somewhat by reading your book, but the service onto others and finding the places we can do that in this world that can feel very disconnected, right? Where, the news is devastating every day and, it can just feel kind of overbearing. And there are these moments of we just really have to continue to help each other as humans all over the world. So one last question. You share excellent strategies for empowerment-driven management approaches. How might members of our audience take those back to their own organizations, especially if they are not the ultimate decision maker? Most of us have bosses. I hope most of us have bosses we like, but most of us aren't the ultimate boss.
Yeah. So I think, in a parallel to how we were just talking about people younger in their careers, it's easy to think that change can only come from above, right? So wherever you are in the hierarchy, there is a scope, there's a zone of action you have, and an ability to influence, right? And so, of course, you can convince your boss, right? But even if that seems unlikely because of the setting you find yourself in, there are a range of strategies, including, connecting to peers, thinking about communities of practice, thinking about how you can manage and interact differently with your own team. Change. A system changes because the people in the system change. Government is a fiction. The state does nothing. Human beings who collectively call themselves the state, right? Act in the name of the state, do the stuff. And there are so many entry points. There are so many strategies. I have to say that chapter of the book is the one that, it could have been 50 pages longer because there are just so many entry points. It depends on where you are and what levers you hold. But I have yet to find somebody who, it seems to me, has none. We all have levers. They look different, they feel different, they work differently, but they exist everywhere.
Well, I think that is all we have time for with Dan. So please join me in giving him a huge round of applause. And we're gonna go off and then come back real quick.
Thank you.